Hello, I'm Orkan Amashov. Very pleased to be joined by my esteemed colleague, Anita Sharma. Today we're discussing developments in Angola. US President Joe Biden is in the African country right now. As we speak, he's meeting with the President of Angola, Joao Lourenço. Biden is fulfilling a promise to visit sub-Saharan Africa on what could be his final foreign trip before leaving office in January. This is the first time any US president has ever visited Angola. Biden's Angola visit is focused on energy and security issues in the region. The US is said to have been interested in a railway project that aims to divert critical minerals away from China. Washington is now investing millions of dollars in Angola and gradually forging ties with this strategic country, with which it was at odds at some point in the past. Angola was firmly in the political orbit of China and Russia after independence from Portuguese colonial rule. And since 2017, President Joao Lourenço has steered it towards closer relations with the United States. The two will talk about trade, energy, and many other issues. Angola and the US are also set to hold a defense cooperation meeting next year on cyber and maritime security. Joining us to talk about this further is Jorge Oliveira, an expert on energy, commodities, and geopolitical issues. He's also the former Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs of Portugal. Mr. Oliveira, what a great delight and honor to be able to welcome you here. Thank you very much for joining.
Thank you.
First of all, let's get basics right. What are your thoughts on the timing of Biden's visit?
Now, truly speaking, this visit was scheduled to take place 2 years ago. It had to be postponed. I sincerely think that Biden is honoring a commitment he had to go not only to Angola. And although most of the news are really focused on the future endeavors or potential endeavors of US and US companies in Angola, it's important to remember that the United States has really significant vested interests in a lot of oil exploitation in Angola for decades. I think Biden went there also to make sure that the are safeguarded and that new oil exploitation areas that are being opened by the Angolan government, the American companies will have a possibility of or at least a fair chance of getting concessions on them as well.
George, it's Anita here. Once again, thank you for being with Orkan and I. Much appreciated. Such an important conversation that needs to be had. You said that this was a meeting that had been postponed. It's happening just weeks before President Biden leaves office. Let's stick with the American companies for a second and just talk about their vested interest, if you will, in oil. But not only oil, George, we're talking transport, railway, as well as ports. And of course, I'd be remiss if we didn't discuss what Orkan said off the top, that 800-mile project, which is funded essentially by the US and the EU, described by the current president, and I quote, as the biggest US rail investment in Africa ever, by which of course I mean the Lobito Corridor that's going to link Angola's part of Lobito to the Democratic Republic of Congo, with a branch line extending to Zambia. How critical, George, is this for US and Angola to have a significant relationship moving forward?
Well, it's very significant, but perhaps it is important. Look, nowadays, media and investment and analysts of all kinds have access to the information that is available nowadays, in the last decade, especially in the last years, when people started to speak about this corridor and this large rail. It's important to remember that this railway existed already in colonial time. Of course, there was no agreement so clear as there is now for the transportation of commodities, but this had been hit 60 years ago. This was happening. Then it was suspended. Then the Chinese removed the line. Now what we're talking about is about improving the line and operating the line. And yes, the line will continue to be crucial for export a lot of the critical minerals that are being extracted in Southeast Democratic Republic of Congo and in Zambia. The problem here is that everybody is looking at this from a geopolitical point of view, which is okay, makes sense, and it's natural that the United States and Europe are very interested in safeguarding that they have a foothold on some logistics infrastructure that is going to be determinant for, or very important for having access to critical metals, for critical minerals. But the reality is that all critical minerals nowadays, they are being extracted almost, I mean, I don't want to say all of them, almost all of them are being extracted by Chinese companies, namely state-owned enterprise companies. And in a very, perhaps the only case where there was a change, even after Biden's strong commitments for alternative programs to the Belt and Road Initiative, after strong commitments from Ursula von der Leyen and the European Union, a keen interest in increasing an European foothold in Africa. The reality is that the only relevant mine that I remember that has changed hands was a mine in Southeast Asia, in Southeast Congo, which used to be operated by an American company, and the American company refused a very, very nice proposition from a Chinese state-owned enterprise, and it sold. Because at the end of the day, geopolitical considerations are very interesting, but companies run based on profits. And if the buying price is they will sell. So there's a lot to be done in this respect, and it's important to remember that American and European companies, or Japanese to this extent, operate almost quasi only based on the income that they can generate and the profits that they can make, whilst many of the Chinese companies that operate on strategic areas are state-owned enterprises, but even when they are private companies, they work in close articulation with the interests of their state.
I know Oregon's going to dive deep
into the corridor is
the...
interesting.
Yeah, go ahead.
No, the corridor is interesting, but it will be pointless in terms of its ultimate aim if there are American or European companies actually exploiting and extracting critical minerals. And currently, there almost isn't.
Well, it's fascinating, right? Because a lot of the minerals that they're trying to extract, from what I've read, insofar as doing research for this interview is concerned, a lot of these can be used for electric vehicles. And who do we have who has the ear of the incoming president, President-elect Trump? That's Elon Musk. I'm sure he'd be very interested to get his hands, if you will, on these minerals that will essentially create the batteries that help support these electric vehicles. And you mentioned, going back to the fact that China's been so prevalent in this area for quite some time. My goodness, Orkin and George, it seems like China's been in the African region since 2000, at least with respect to holding summits with various countries. And it also, I should also mention Russia, Turkey, and Japan as well have held summits to some lesser degree. But speaking of lesser degree, the United States really only entered with a summit in 2014, and this one that's happening right now, Orkin, is just the second one since then. So it seems like the U.S. has a lot of catch-up to do, if you will, which I believe George has alluded to.
Indeed, yeah. And also my question to Mr. George Oliveira is going to be about this wider geopolitical ramifications. Of course, not everything is geopolitics, and not everything could be understood within the confines of geopolitics. But still, what do you think this visit signifies in the context of wider US-China competition? Because as we understand, China has a significant footprint in this country, in Angola, also on the continent. And Angola is a regional power, both militarily and economically, very much like Nigeria and South Africa. And after so many years of strong ties with China, President João Lourenço is now committed to what he calls a multipolar foreign policy. And do you think in the long run, so just connecting it with the question you posed earlier, that US will be able to replace China as a main partner for Angola?
It's a very good question, but to be fair, I think that what the current leadership in Angola aims and what they are doing is precisely not to be dependent on any one superpower or great power in the world. So they they reaped some benefits, especially in terms of credit lines that were opened by China. But most of those credit lines, they were done also linked with the oil business, with the oil exports to China. Remember, a lot of the oil extracted in Angola is extracted by American companies, but at the end of the day, the buyer for almost all of it is China. And the reality is that the current government did not like the dependence that they were having from China. Also, the credit lines that started to be opened by a quasi-state entity, a closed fund called CIF, linked to a nefarious character named Sampa that apparently was arrested and disappeared out of the scene, was later replaced by normal credit lines by the ICBC. But as far as I recall, in the last year, no such mechanism. So on the one hand, Angola was displeased with the fact that it was becoming too dependent on their power. On the other hand, it really needed to find other alternatives of sourcing foreign direct investment for the country. The move that the current leadership under João Lourenço has done is absolutely normal. There's a big difference, as I would like to remind again, that between Europeans and Africans, between Europeans and Americans on the one hand, and Chinese on the other. Chinese have a much easier way of articulating their state-owned even private enterprises with the state, with China's goals and geopolitical aims. And a problem. And, there are things that usually nobody mentions, because the government of Angola also, it's normal, every government wants to put the focus on the spotlights on the successes. But Angola opened a huge privatization program of almost 250 state-owned companies. It asked for the help of the World Bank and the United States, and the help was provided, and they were expecting that significant investment would come into that privatization from the West, especially from the United States. The reality is it didn't. So there are many. This is a component that this is a step that is being done that makes sense from the point of view of Angola. Militarily and politically, Angola is far more stable than any of the DRC, for instance. And it is really a military powerhouse in that region. So it is normal that in the military area, the cooperation has increased with the United States. It has also increased in space programs. But for instance, if you look at, for instance, a really strategic company that exists in Angola called Cables, that manages the submarine telecommunications cables that link Angola to both South America and to the Indian Pacific, to South Asia and then Southeast Asia. This company, no Western company appeared interested on it, and she was on one of those 250 companies on the privatization list. So it was snatched by a bargain price by a Chinese company. So the West has great ideas and great intentions and beautiful speeches, but its companies don't follow on those geopolitical concerns.
George, you mentioned the World Bank and how Angola sought support from this powerhouse to move its economic initiatives forward. Let's stay with that if we can. In the last 2 decades, we also know that China's essentially, in a dramatic fashion, managed to replace the World Bank and the United States in Angola and several African countries, we should say, while Washington seems to have retreated from Africa. My question to you, sir, is how can the United States once again lead in Africa with China, while it seems to be taking a bit of a sidestep here, still very relevant in the country as well as in the continent? What are your thoughts there?
Well, there are several angles there that the interesting question raises. The first thing that I think is important to bear in mind is that, yes, the Chinese came. The Chinese occupied a significant role and a significant space in many areas of economic activity. And the main reason for that, it's not that there is more capital in China interested in Africa. It's simply that the capital that China wanted to place in Africa, on the one hand, was state capital, and have geopolitical considerations on the one hand, and on the other, whilst the loans granted via European banks or American banks or multilateral institutions like the World Bank, but under Western leaders, they always, that kind of funding always comes with conditions, namely with an assessment on the economic framework and especially civil liberties and human rights framework. The money that came from China came completely devoid of any such restrictions or concerns.
Wow.
So it was very much welcome in many of the countries. They would not have to be subject to normal inquiries from its bankers, and that was a great change that took place in Africa. But the most important change that took place in the recent years, in my opinion, comes from China itself. The key entity that pivots most of the loans from China is the China's Development Bank and an autonomous entity, only composed from the China Development, called the China Africa Development Fund. And the China Africa Development Fund started to have a lot of pressure from the regulatory entities in China because it was losing money on all the fields. So they had to reassess their criteria and to make credit make their credit and their loans or done on a professional basis. So suddenly, more football fields being built by Chinese companies or with Chinese funds, or national parliaments, or gigantic displays of public statuary and the kind. So all that finished. And they decided to focus more on the area, not the area where they were making more money, but actually the area where they were losing less money in terms of their loans, which was the manufacturing. And this was in line with great flow of Chinese companies delocalizing where costs are high, from the rents to the wages, and where the demographics are clear. In 20 years, many of those companies that need 10,000 workers probably are going to face difficulties in finding workers. So they moved to Africa, and especially to Eastern Africa, and that that was done in consonance with the China Development Bank policy, and it coincided. Well, of course, most of these companies, they have fundings from the main state-owned banks, the Bank of China, ICBC, the Construction Bank, and so on. But this was all done under the leadership of the Chinese Development Bank, and the reality is, in a nutshell, the China Development Bank reduced its footprint in Africa. The public investment from China was reduced already in the last 3 years. Most of the investment in China, majority of the investment in China, the clear majority, I don't know I know the numbers from 2 years ago, but it was probably 55%. Now it should be 60% of the investment, of the Chinese investment in Africa is private investment. And that is a big switch. And that, in that regard, it is a bit irrelevant what the politicians in the US and Europe state. If what is important is that there are mechanisms that, if there are policies that or economic realities that the private companies perceive as interesting to delocalize to Africa. And the fact is, European American companies have not been delocalizing to Africa. They have not been investing significantly in Africa. They have been investing more easily in Southeast Asia. So I don't think that we're going to see great changes in that regard.
Okay, very interesting. So it seems like the networks are already
Indeed,
created
and
there.
if I may ask my last question, and we have very limited time now, is about what's going to happen tomorrow. We know that Joe Biden will wrap up his trip to Angola with a summit with leaders from Democratic Republic of the Congo and Tanzania and Zambia. What could we expect from this summit? What does it signify?
Well, I think the United States is doing something clever, which is to try to create a club of friends. And that is politically interesting. I don't think it will change a lot because ultimately what changes the world are the vested interests arising from business. And those vested interests are almost entirely dependent on private investment, even in the case of the Chinese, as I mentioned. So I don't think it is relevant. It is important. It signifies a commitment of the United States towards Africa that have not been seen recently at the highest level. I mean, we have seen that happening with minor representatives of the United States. But I don't think it's going to change a lot.
I see. Well, thank you very much indeed for your time and for your very, very enlightening answers. We are very much grateful to you.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
Thank you. Very interesting conversation.
Absolutely, Orkin, absolutely.
Yeah,
Thank you,
time
George.
to wrap up, I suppose, now. Yes, we had an opportunity to interview Mr. George Oliveira, an expert on energy, commodities and geopolitical issues. He's also former Secretary of State of Foreign Affairs of Portugal. That's all for now, and see you very soon indeed.